Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive. We've got a stack of sources here, articles, research papers, notes, all focused on one, well, pretty fascinating metric, heart rate variability, HRV.
Yeah, you see it everywhere now, right?
Exactly. You might have spotted this number on your fitness tracker, maybe your smartwatch, and sort of wondered, what is that actually telling me?
And that's really our mission today.
Yeah.
We want to, peel back the layers a bit, understand what HRV really is, how that tech on your wrist is even capturing it, and look at its applications, which are surprisingly broad.
Right, from stress to sports, even things like long COVID.
Absolutely. Think of HRV less as just a number and more like a window into your body's automatic control system, how well it's handling stress, how it's recovering, adapting to life.
Okay, so let's jump right in then. What is heart rate variability? Because it's really crucial, isn't it, to know it's not the same as just your heart rate.
Oh, absolutely not. That's the first key thing. Your heart rate, that's just the average beats per minute, simple average.
60 beats, 70 beats, whatever it is.
Right. HRV, though, is about the variation, the fluctuation in the time intervals between those consecutive heartbeats. Your heart doesn't beat like a perfect metronome.
Ah, okay. So there are tiny differences in timing from one beat to the next.
Tiny, yeah. We're talking milliseconds. But those subtle differences, measuring them, that's HRV.
And why do those tiny millisecond fluctuations matter so much?
Well, because they give us this powerful, non-invasive glimpse into the autonomic nervous system, the ANS.
The ANS, okay, that's the body's automatic pilot, right? Running things behind the scenes.
Exactly. Breathing, digestion, blood pressure, and, critically, your stress and recovery responses.
So the classic fight or flight versus rest and digest.
Precisely. The ANS has those two main branches.
Yeah.
You've got the sympathetic, that's your accelerator, the fight or flight, the parasympathetic, that's the brake, the rest and digest, calm down system.
And HRV shows us
Yeah.
the balance between them.
Yeah, it reflects the interplay, the dynamic balance between the two. Generally speaking, a higher HRV, more variability, suggests a healthy, adaptable ANS. Your body's ready to respond appropriately, ramp up or calm down.
Okay. And lower HRV.
Lower HRV can suggest the system is less flexible. Maybe it's stuck more in that sympathetic stress state or just not adapting as well. Physiological distress, basically.
So it's this intricate dance happening automatically, and the beat timings reflect that. How do we actually measure it? What's the raw data look like?
So the raw data is simply the time measured between successive heartbeats. It's called the interbeat interval, or IBI. You might also see it called the RR interval.
RR interval. Because on an ECG, it's measured between the R waves.
Exactly. That's where the term comes from.
Okay, so you have this list of beat-to-beat times. How does that become the single HRV number I see? I know there are different kinds of HRV metrics.
Right. It's not just one calculation. From that raw IBI data, different mathematical formulas are applied. You've got time domain metrics first. Yeah, they look at the variability over a set period. Could be short, like 5 minutes, or long, like 24 hours. RMSSD is a really common one.
RMSSD, root mean square of successive differences. Sounds complex.
It sounds it, but it's basically looking at the differences between adjacent beats. It's quite sensitive to the parasympathetic side, the rest and digest activity.
Okay. And there are others in that category.
Yeah, SDNN is another big one, standard deviation of NN intervals. That gives you more of a picture of the overall variability, usually requires a longer recording period, like 20 minutes or even 24 hours.
Got it. And then you mentioned frequency domain. That sounds different.
It is. These methods use signal processing techniques, like Fourier transforms, to break down the HRV pattern into different frequency bands.
Like different rhythms within the variability.
Sort of. High-frequency power, HF, that's strongly linked to the parasympathetic system, often influenced by breathing. Low-frequency power, LF, is a bit more debated, seems to reflect a mix of both sympathetic and parasympathetic activity.
And the LF-HF ratio, I've seen that mentioned.
Yeah, some people use the ratio of LF to HF as a proxy for the sympathetic balance, the balance between the two branches. But the sources are pretty clear that this interpretation is controversial and needs context.
Okay. And there are even other types, nonlinear.
Yes, less common in consumer stuff, but things like Poincare plots or fractal analysis. They look more at the complexity and patterns over time. Getting this data traditionally meant ECGs, sometimes Holter monitors worn for 24 hours.
Right, clinical settings. And someone often had to check the data for errors.
Yeah, artifacts and errors in the recording needed correcting. There are standard guidelines, like from a 1996 task force that recommended specific measures like SDNN and RMSSD, trying to bring some consistency.
Which brings us then to wearables. This is where it gets really accessible for most of us. How is my watch figuring this out?
Well, this is the tech revolution, really. Consumer wearables, watches, rings, armbands, they typically use optical sensors. PPG, photoplethysmography.
Those little flashing green or red lights on the back?
Exactly. They shine light into your skin and detect the changes in blood volume with each pulse. From those pulse waves, they estimate the time between beats at IBI and then run the calculations to get HRV metrics.
So it's not directly measuring the heart's electrical signal like an ECG, but the blood flow pulse?
Right. It's an indirect measure, but it's become quite good. It makes HRV tracking super accessible, continuous, and relatively cheap compared to clinical gear.
But how accurate is it? Can I trust the number from my watch compared to, say, a proper ECG?
That's the key question. Research comparing wearables to ECGs generally finds what they call small acceptable error. It might not give you the exact same absolute millisecond value as an ECG at any given moment.
Okay.
But crucially, they're considered valid for tracking trends over time. Is your HRV generally going up, going down, staying stable? That's where the value lies for personal use.
Right, and that really connects to that comparison study we looked at. The one comparing Apple Watch, Fitbit, Garmin, Oura, Whoop. What was the big takeaway there?
The absolute biggest takeaway was that the raw numbers, the actual HRV score in milliseconds, or even resting heart rate, often differ significantly between the different brands.
So my Oura might say 60 MEAs, and my friend's Garmin might say 45 MEAs, even if we're physiologically similar.
Precisely. That study found, for instance, maybe a 10-beat difference in resting heart rate between Oura and Fitbit. Oura often showed higher HRV, lower RHR. Apple Watch sometimes showed lower HRV and didn't always track trends the same way as others.
Wow. So comparing my number to someone else's using a different device, it's pointless.
Basically, yes. It's comparing apples and oranges. They use different sensors, different algorithms, filtering the noise, different sampling rates, different ways of calculating the final number. It all leads to variations.
That is such a crucial insight. So forget comparing with friends or online averages from different tech.
Forget it. The real power comes from consistency. Use one device, track your own baseline, and watch your personal trends over days, weeks, months. That's the actionable information. Is your HRV trending up or down relative to your normal?
Okay, that makes sense. Consistency is key. So, assuming we're tracking our trends, what can they tell us? Let's talk psychological stress. How direct is the link?
It's pretty direct. Psychological stress absolutely triggers physiological changes via that autonomic nervous system. And HRV changes are seen as a really valuable objective marker of that stress response.
So researchers look at this how? They stress people out and measure HRV.
Well, sometimes yes, in controlled settings, but also by tracking people in real life. They use repeated HRV measurements alongside validated tools like stress questionnaires to correlate subjective feelings with the objective HRV data.
What kind of stressors have they studied?
Oh, all sorts. The sources mention real-life stuff like the stress before a big academic exam, anxiety before giving blood, anticipatory stress in athletes before competition, even chronic stress linked to things like depression or rumination.
Okay, and lab stress.
Yep, experimentally induced stress, too. Things like doing mental arithmetic under pressure, the Stroop color word test, public speaking tasks. The Trier social stress test, the TSST, is a big one in research, known to reliably induce stress.
And what generally happens to HRV under stress? Does it go up or down?
Down, consistently down. When you're stressed, that sympathetic fight-or-flight system ramps up, and the parasympathetic rest and digest gets suppressed. This makes the heart beat more like a metronome, less variability.
So lower HRV, well, higher stress state generally.
Generally, yes. And RMSSD, that time domain metric we mentioned, often shows the most significant drop in response to stress. That Stanford Wells study using smartwatches to estimate stress. They were likely relying heavily on changes in metrics like RMSSD.
So if I have a really demanding day at work or a big argument, I might actually see that reflected in my HRV score later that night or the next morning.
You very well might. Yeah, it can be that physiological echo of the stress you experience, sometimes even before you consciously register just how stressed you were. It's your ANS basically saying, okay, that was tough.
Fascinating. Okay, moving beyond stress, HRV is massive in sports physiology too, isn't it?
Huge. Athletes and coaches use it to monitor how the body, specifically the ANS, is responding to training load, and crucially, how well it's recovering. The goal is optimization train effectively. Recover fully, avoid burnout.
So you track HRV to see if you're adapting well to your workouts.
Exactly. Are you bouncing back? Is your body handling the load? Monitoring HRV indices can help answer that.
Does the type of exercise matter, like intensity?
Oh, absolutely. HRV changes aren't uniform across all exercise. Intensity really matters. Metrics like the LF-HF ratio can shift differently depending on whether you're exercising below or above certain thresholds, like your ventilatory thresholds.
And recovery after exercise.
That's a big one. How quickly your HRV, particularly the parasympathetic markers like RMSSD or HF power, bounces back after a workout is a really good indicator of your fitness level. Faster recovery usually means better conditioning.
So fitter athletes recover their HRV quicker.
Generally, yes. And there's even interest in using ultra-short-term HRV measures, like just 60 seconds, for quick checks on athletes, say, in team sports settings.
And the overtraining aspect, how does HMV help prevent that?
This is key. Overtraining, or non-functional overreaching, happens when you push too hard for too long without enough recovery. Performance tanks, you feel awful. Consistently low or dropping HRV despite rest days can be an early warning sign.
A red flag from your nervous system.
Exactly. So some approaches involve using daily HRV readiness scores to guide training. If your HRV is low compared to your baseline, maybe you swap that intense session for an easier recovery workout, or even take an extra rest day. It helps keep things in balance.
That proactive approach makes a lot of sense. Now, this focus on recovery connects to something really important and more recent. Long COVID and PM, post-exertional malaise, HRV seems to be offering some real insights there.
Yes, this is a really vital area where HRV monitoring is proving useful. Many long COVID patients struggle with autonomic dysfunction and this debilitating PM, where even minor exertion triggers a crash.
Right. And that study using wearables on long COVID patients, what did it show?
It showed some pretty stark differences. First, HRV was just generally lower in the long COVID group compared to healthy controls, even during sleep and normal daily life. Their baseline ANS function seemed suppressed.
Okay. But the really striking part was the PM link.
Yes. The most significant finding was about recovery after exercise.
Right.
Even after mild exertion, the patient's HRV didn't just recover slower. It remained significantly lower for a full 24 hours afterwards.
24 hours after
Yeah.
mild exertion.
Yeah. It points to a profound, prolonged disruption in their autonomic recovery processes. Their rest and digest system just wasn't kicking back in properly.
So their body stays in a kind of stress state long after the activity stops.
That's what the data suggests. And the study also found that if the exercise was longer or more intense, the HRV drop during the following night's sleep was even more pronounced in the patients. Sleep wasn't providing the expected recovery.
That sounds incredibly difficult to manage. Did the study offer any practical takeaways?
It did. It suggested that the first ventilatory threshold, VT1, could be a useful marker.
VT1, remind us quickly.
That's roughly the point where your breathing rate starts to increase noticeably, moving from easy conversational pace exercise to slightly harder effort, where talking becomes a bit more difficult.
Okay.
The study found that exercise performed above that VT1 intensity seemed to particularly trigger this prolonged blunting of HRV recovery in the patients. So VT1 might represent a sort of personalized, safe exertion threshold for individuals trying to manage PE.
Wow, that could be incredibly helpful for pacing.
It's exactly. Continuous HRV monitoring with a wearable could potentially empower patients to understand their own limits, get objective feedback, and hopefully avoid triggering those PEM crashes by staying below that threshold.
Okay, let's touch briefly on the more established clinical uses. Where else does HRV show up in medicine?
It has roles in assessing autonomic neuropathy, for instance, in diabetes, where nerve damage can affect ANS control. And it's used quite a bit in cardiology for risk stratification.
Risk stratification, like predicting future problems.
Yeah, particularly after a heart attack, myocardial infarction, or in patients with congestive heart failure. Lower overall HRV, specifically if the SDNN measure falls below about 70 milliseconds, is linked to a higher risk of mortality in those groups.
So it can predict risk. How reliably?
It adds value, but it's not perfect on its own. Its positive predictive value, identifying who will have an event, is limited, but its negative predictive value is better. It's quite good at identifying patients who are not at high immediate risk.
So useful, but maybe best combined with other information.
Definitely. The sources really emphasize that combining HRV data with other standard cardiac markers, things like ejection fraction, arrhythmias significantly boosts its predictive power. A multi-marker approach is better.
Are there still challenges in using it clinically?
Oh yeah. Standardization is still a hurdle. Different measurement methods, devices, analysis software, study protocols. It makes comparing results across studies difficult sometimes. There's ongoing work towards more universally accepted standards.
Understood. Well, this has been a fascinating journey through HRV. We start with the basics. It's the variation between the beats, reflecting our automatic nervous system.
Right. Then how wearables, those optical sensors, make tracking it so accessible, even if the absolute numbers vary device to device.
Yeah, that consistency point is key. And then we saw its power reflecting psychological stress,
Guiding athletic training and preventing overtraining.
offering real tangible insights for managing conditions like long COVID and PM.
And even playing a role in clinical risk assessment, especially when combined with other data.
So for anyone listening who tracks their HRV, the big message seems to be, don't obsess over the single number or compare it to others. Focus on your trends over time with your consistent device.
Exactly. That trend line is your personal window into your body's resilience, your recovery, your readiness for the day. It's a non-invasive look at how your system is coping.
And maybe a final thought to leave folks with. Consider how this accessible physiological data, like HRV from your wrist, is fundamentally shifting things. We're moving from needing a clinic for this kind of insight to having it constantly available. How might this democratization of our own body's data change how we approach health? Moving perhaps from just reacting to problems towards proactively understanding and fine-tuning our well-being based on these subtle, real-time signals.